Now, at this point in this lesson, you may be totally convinced that free trade is always best for a nation. After all, I've demonstrated to you that there are economic gains from trade. And I have also shown you that there are deadweight efficiency losses from protectionism. Nonetheless, it is useful at this point to review some of the legitimate as well as arguably illegitimate arguments for protectionist trade barriers. Let's start then with the national defense or military self-sufficiency argument. The national security argument in support of protectionism is not an economic one so much as a political and strategic one. It runs as follows. Protective tariffs are needed to preserve or strengthen key industries, such as steel or motor vehicles, or even certain kinds of computer chips that are needed to produce weapon systems essential for the defense of the homeland or to wage war on strategic rivals. The problem here, of course, in evaluating this argument is that there are no real objective criteria for weighing any benefits of an increase in national security that may result from protecting a domestic industry against the costs that result from a decrease in economic efficiency. Closely related to the national security argument in support of protectionism is the so-called infant industry argument. It is an argument that is seductively and intuitively simple. By temporarily shielding young domestic firms from the severe competition of more mature and more efficient foreign firms, a protectionist nation will give its own infant industries a chance to develop and eventually become efficient producers and even national champions. In fact, historical studies have turned up some genuine cases of protected infant industries that grew up to stand on their own feet. Studies of successfully industrialized countries, such as Singapore and South Korea, show that nations such as these have often protected their manufacturing industries from imports during the early stages of industrialization. That said, a careful review of the history of tariffs reveals other contrary cases involving key industries like that of steel, sugar, and textiles. In far too many cases, these perpetually protected infant industries have never shed their figurative diapers after many years, but simply dragged down the economies of the protectionists. A third key argument in defense of protectionism is that tariffs or quotas or other various non-tariff barriers may sometimes be necessary to save the jobs of a nation. This is perhaps the most politically charged argument in defense of protectionism, and it is certainly true that elections have been won or lost around the world by candidates who have fought over whether protectionist policies are necessary to save jobs. In evaluating this argument, the key question to ask is this. Are the protectionist measures being used to defend that nation's markets against traders and trading partners that are using mercantilist trade practices like illegal export subsidies or currency manipulation or lax environmental controls to gain an unfair advantage? In such cases where the answer is yes, the save our jobs argument carries far more weight than the counterexample in which other nations are trading fairly, but the protectionist simply wants to gain an unfair advantage under the rhetorical guise of save our jobs. And in such cases where a trading partner is obviously engaged in unfair trade practices, tariffs and quotas may be viewed as more defensive than protectionist in nature. Closely related to the save our jobs argument is the defense against dumping argument. As we previously discussed, dumping occurs when foreign producers sell their exports at a price less than the cost of production. Just why might the companies of some nations dump products below cost into the markets of other nations? Here's one possible strategic reason. The corporate goal may simply be to drive competition and competitors out of the market, seize that market, and then use the newfound monopoly power to later raise prices. In such cases, the long-term economic profits resulting from this predatory dumping strategy may more than offset the earlier losses that accompanied the initial dumping. So it is a perfectly rational economic strategy for a company and an equally national industrial policy for a mercantilist nation to adopt. That said, the more common economic reason for dumping is this. When a recession hits and unemployment rises in a nation, desperate companies seeking to avoid bankruptcy may try to stay in business by dumping their excess capacity into foreign markets at fire sale prices. In such cases, the national government often facilitates this dumping to keep a lid on domestic political pressure and unrest while saving jobs. Of course, regardless of the reason for the dumping, the imposition of so-called countervailing tariffs to defend against such dumping are quite legitimate and arguably necessary. Now, to end this lesson, let's move on to our final module and an interesting case example that illustrates the frequent clashes between the academic world of standard Ricardian free trade theory and the far more rough and tumble real corporate world of an international trading system that is often severely constrained by protectionist and mercantilist behavior.